There's a room inside you that no one else can enter. Your therapist can't get in. Neither can your partner or the friend who has known you for 20 years. You can describe the room to them. You can let them stand at the threshold and look in. But the work that happens inside, the actual healing, has to be done by you, alone, with no one watching and no one able to help. This is the truth almost nobody tells you about getting better. And it's the reason so many people spend decades in therapy, attend every workshop, read every book, follow every teacher with desperate devotion, and still feel exactly the same underneath it all. They've been knocking on the door of that room their entire lives, hoping someone else will open it. And nobody can. The door only opens from the inside. Carl Jung understood this earlier than almost anyone in his field. He spent the first part of his career believing what most of his colleagues believed, that the analyst was the primary engine of healing, that the relationship between doctor and patient was where transformation actually happened. And then something occurred that changed his understanding of psychology completely. In 1913, Jung went through what he later described as a confrontation with his own unconscious, a period of breakdown so destabilizing that he questioned his sanity for years. And what he discovered during that descent was something he hadn't been prepared for. None of his mentors could meet him there. The relationships that had sustained his outer life had no access to the inner one. The colleagues he'd respected most thought he was losing his grip. He was alone in the room, and the only way out was through it. What he found on the other side of that solitary work became the foundation of everything he taught for the rest of his life. He started seeing his patients differently. He started seeing himself differently. And he began to understand what healing actually required, which turned out to be almost the opposite of what the entire psychiatric profession had been telling people for decades. Today, I walk you through what Jung learned about healing yourself without depending on anyone. Why the search for external rescuers keeps people locked inside the very wound they're trying to escape. What he called the inner authority, the part of you that has to take over before any real change becomes possible. And the specific kind of work he discovered that nobody else can do for you, no matter how skilled, how loving, or how committed they are to your well-being. Let's start with what Jung observed about how people actually approach healing. He noticed a pattern in almost every patient who walked into his office. They had come to him because they were suffering, but the way they framed their suffering revealed something important. They saw themselves as broken, and they saw him as the one who could fix them. They came carrying the unspoken expectation that he would do the work, that he would diagnose, prescribe, guide, and ultimately deliver them from whatever was tormenting them. And Jung understood why. The pattern of looking outward for repair starts in childhood. When you're small, you actually do need someone else to regulate you, to soothe you, to make sense of what's happening to you. The adult does the work the child can't do yet. This is healthy at that age. It's how a nervous system learns to organize itself. But something can go wrong in this process, and for many people, it does. If the adults around you couldn't or wouldn't do that work, if your parents were absent, overwhelmed, dysfunctional, or simply unable to meet you where you needed to be met, then a part of you stayed waiting for someone to finally show up and do the regulating that was supposed to happen back then. That waiting doesn't end when you become an adult. It just shifts targets. You start looking at partners, therapists, mentors, teachers, sometimes even strangers, with that same unconscious expectation. They will be the one. They will finally do what nobody did when it mattered. Jung saw this everywhere in his practice, and he was honest about the trap it created. Because as long as the patient saw the healing as something that came from him, the patient stayed in the position of the child waiting for the parent. They might get insight, they might experience emotional relief, but the underlying structure of dependence stayed exactly the same. They were still waiting to be saved. They had just found a more sophisticated authority figure to wait for. And here is what made Jung's discovery so important. He realized that this very dynamic, the search for the external healer, was often the central wound itself, not just a symptom of it. The patient wasn't broken because of what happened to them in childhood. They were broken because they had outsourced their own inner authority to people who couldn't carry it. and they kept outsourcing it, in adult form, to anyone who looked qualified enough to receive the projection. This is the room nobody can enter for you. The room where you stop waiting. The room where you take back the authority you handed away before you understood what you were handing away. Jung's own descent gave him a felt understanding of what this looked like in practice. During his breakdown, he reached the point where his usual sources of support couldn't help him. His relationship with Freud had collapsed. His professional standing felt uncertain. His usual ways of orienting himself in the world were dissolving, and he had a choice. He could either find a new external authority to lean on, a new mentor, a new theoretical framework, a new community to validate him, or he could go into the room alone and see what happened. He went in alone, not because he was brave, but because he had run out of other options, and what he encountered there changed his entire understanding of the psyche. He discovered that there was something inside him that knew. Something that wasn't his ego, wasn't his conditioning, wasn't his trained intellect. Something deeper that, when he stopped trying to find answers from outside, began offering them from within. He called this the self, the deeper organizing intelligence that contains the conscious mind and extends beyond it. He found that when he stopped trying to make sense of his breakdown using the frameworks he'd learned and instead sat with whatever was actually happening, images would arise, memories, symbols, sometimes whole inner dialogues with figures he didn't consciously create, and these inner figures had things to tell him. The unconscious was communicating, and if he could learn to listen, he could participate in his own healing in a way no outside person could enable. This was the breakthrough. Healing wasn't something done to him. It was something that happened through a relationship he developed with his own depths. And that relationship, the inner one, the one in the room, was the only one that could touch the actual wound. He didn't conclude from this that therapy was useless or that human connection didn't matter. He kept practicing, kept seeing patients, kept valuing his closest relationships for the rest of his life. But he reorganized his understanding of what those relationships could and couldn't do. He saw that the most a good therapist could offer was a kind of midwifery. They could create the conditions, hold the space, support the descent, but they couldn't do the work itself. The work was internal, and the person doing it had to be the patient. This is the part of Jung's thought that gets the least attention in popular psychology, and probably the most important. Because most people who are suffering are still operating with the wrong model. They believe that if they just find the right helper, the right method, the right framework, healing will finally arrive. And they keep being disappointed because that isn't how the psyche works. What does work, according to Jung's observation across decades of practice, is something much harder than finding the right person. It involves learning to do for yourself what you've been waiting for someone else to do. Learning to be present to yourself in the way you've been hoping someone would be present to you. Learning to sit in the room and stay there, even when the room feels unbearable. And this is where most people stop, because the room is unbearable for a reason. Inside that room is everything you've been outsourcing the management of. Every feeling you couldn't sit with alone. Every memory that needed someone else to help you make sense of it. Every part of yourself that you split off because you couldn't hold it without help. All of that is in there, waiting. And the moment you walk in alone, it all comes up to meet you. Most people walk into the room, feel what's there, and walk back out immediately. They go find another helper, another distraction, another relationship, another method. Anything to avoid being alone with what they've been carrying. And then they wonder why nothing changes. But some people, usually because they've run out of options or because something inside them has finally said enough, stay in the room a little longer. And what they discover is that the unbearable becomes slowly more bearable when you don't run from it. The pain doesn't disappear, but something else develops in you while you stay with the pain. A capacity, a muscle, a particular kind of internal presence that wasn't there before. Jung called the cultivation of this capacity the development of the transcendent function. The phrase sounds abstract, but what he meant by it was very practical. He meant the ability to hold opposite states at the same time without collapsing into either of them. To feel the wound and stay present to yourself feeling it. to experience the chaos of the unconscious without losing your conscious footing, to be with what's hard in yourself without immediately needing someone else to make it easier. This capacity is what he meant by healing. He wasn't pointing at the absence of pain or some elevated state of permanent okayness. He meant becoming someone who could be with themselves fully, even in the difficult parts, and discover that this presence itself was what they'd been looking for from other people their entire lives. Before we go further into the actual practice of this work, I want to mention something. If what I'm describing is landing in a particular way, if you're recognizing that pattern of waiting, of outsourcing, of looking outside for what only you can build inside, there's a guide we put together that might walk with you into this kind of work. It's called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's framework, built for exactly the kind of inner practice we're talking about right now. The link is below if you want to take a look. But for now, let's keep going, because there's a specific process Jung developed that I want you to understand. The practice Jung developed for working with the unconscious, he called active imagination. Most descriptions of active imagination make it sound either mystical or technical, and it's neither. At its core, it's a method for entering the room intentionally, sitting down inside it, and learning to be present to what arises without controlling it and without running from it. The basic structure is simple to describe and difficult to do. You set aside time. You let your ordinary stream of thoughts settle, and then you wait. You don't try to make anything happen. You don't try to figure anything out. You let images, sensations, memories, fragments of dialogue rise up on their own. And when they do, you stay with them. You let them develop. You ask them questions. You let them speak back. This sounds strange because we're used to thinking of our minds as something we direct. The whole apparatus of modern self-improvement is built on the idea that you can think your way into a better state, decide your way into better feelings, strategize your way out of patterns. Jung discovered that this approach actually keeps the wound in place because it operates entirely from the ego, the conscious, controlling part of the mind, and the wound lives below that level. The unconscious has its own intelligence. It has its own way of trying to heal. And it speaks in images, feelings, symbols, and felt sense, rather than in the logical language the ego understands. When you try to fix yourself through pure thinking, you're trying to repair a wound in one language using only the tools of another. It doesn't reach. Active imagination is essentially the practice of learning to listen in the language the unconscious actually speaks. You sit. You let it come. You take what arises seriously, even when it doesn't make logical sense. And over time, a different kind of relationship develops. A relationship with yourself at a level that ordinary consciousness usually skips right over. Jung was clear that this isn't passive. It isn't daydreaming. It isn't escapism. It requires sustained attention and a particular kind of honesty. When something rises up, you have to be willing to look at it. When an inner figure says something uncomfortable, you have to be willing to hear it. When a feeling emerges that you've been avoiding for years, you have to be willing to sit with it long enough for it to actually be felt. And this is the work nobody else can do for you. A therapist can describe what's happening. A book can give you frameworks. A teacher can point in the direction. But the actual sitting, the actual listening, the actual willingness to stay in the room when everything in you wants to leave, that's yours alone. It has always been yours alone, and it's what changes you when nothing else does. Jung observed something specific about people who took up this practice seriously. Over time, they developed what he described as an inner companion. There was no literal voice telling them what to do, but a felt sense of being accompanied by something inside themselves. Something wiser than their everyday mind, something that knew them more deeply than anyone outside ever could. This inner companion wasn't manufactured, it was discovered. It had been there the whole time, waiting for them to stop looking for an external version of it. And the moment this inner companion became real to them, something shifted in all their other relationships. They stopped grasping. They stopped trying to extract from other people what those people couldn't give them. They could be in connection without being in dependence. They could love without needing to be saved. They could let people close without losing themselves in the process. This is the part Jung found most important. The work of healing yourself without depending on anyone doesn't make you isolated. It makes you finally capable of real connection. Because the version of you that was leaking, grasping, hoping every relationship would somehow fix you, that version couldn't actually connect. It could only need. And need, no matter how it dresses itself up, isn't the same as love. The person who has done the inner work doesn't require the other person to be a certain way in order to be okay. They've built their okayness in the room, and from that place, they can meet other people as they actually are, instead of as something they need them to be in order for the leaking to stop. This is the strange independence Jung saw in his most individuated patients. They weren't cold, they weren't avoidant, they weren't refusing connection. They had simply become so present to themselves that they didn't bring the bottomless hunger to other people anymore. And without that hunger driving the connection could finally be real. There's something I want to address that comes up almost every time someone hears this idea. There's a fear that doing this work means giving up on people. That if you stop depending on others, you'll end up alone. That the inner room is somehow the opposite of human connection. Jung addressed this directly because he saw the fear in his patients constantly. He pointed out that the fear of being alone is usually a fear of being alone with what's inside you. The dread isn't about the absence of other people, it's about the presence of yourself. People surround themselves with constant interaction because the room feels unbearable, and the relationships function as a kind of climate control, keeping the inner weather at a manageable temperature so you never have to actually feel it directly. When you stop relying on relationships for that function, what you discover is that the inner weather is actually survivable. It isn't always pleasant, it isn't easy, but it's survivable. And once you've built the capacity to be with your own weather, you no longer need other people to be a particular way, which means, ironically, you can actually be with them. Without the unconscious agenda of needing them to keep you regulated, you can just be with them as people. This is the depth Jung was pointing at when he talked about individuation. The goal wasn't to become a separate, self-sufficient unit who didn't need anyone. It was about becoming someone whose center of gravity was inside themselves, so that connection could be chosen rather than driven by survival needs. A person like this doesn't need to be alone, but they can be. They don't need to be in relationship, but they can be. The need has stopped running the show, and he found that this kind of person was the only kind who could really love well. Because love, when it's coming from need, is always also a form of demand. You need the person to keep being a certain way so that your inner state stays manageable. You need them to keep meeting your needs in the right form. You need them not to change in ways that threaten your equilibrium. That's love mixed with the unspoken demand to keep being managed. Love from individuation has a different quality. It can let the other person be who they are. It can let them grow in directions you didn't choose. It can let them have their own depths, their own room, their own work. Because your okayness isn't dependent on what they do. You've built it in the room. And from that place, you can give them the same freedom you've given yourself. So how do you actually start this work, practically? Jung was specific about a few things, and they're worth understanding. The first is that you have to be willing to be uncomfortable, not occasionally, not in manageable doses, but as a regular practice. The room contains everything you've been avoiding, and walking in means feeling that. There's no shortcut around this. Any method that promises healing without discomfort is selling something. Real change requires sitting with what doesn't feel good and discovering, over time, that you can be there without being destroyed by it. The second is that you have to develop a relationship with what arises rather than trying to fix it. When a feeling comes up, the impulse is usually to make it go away, to distract from it, to analyze it until it dissolves, to find a strategy that will solve whatever is causing it. Jung's approach was different. He'd ask, "What is this? Where does it come from? What is it trying to tell me?" The questioning was a way of taking the feeling seriously as communication from a part of yourself you usually don't listen to. The third is that you have to do this consistently. A crisis intervention approach won't work. The unconscious doesn't open up to occasional visitors. It opens up to people who show up reliably, who demonstrate over time that they're actually willing to be there. The relationship with yourself builds the same way every other relationship builds, through consistent presence. There's no way to shortcut this. You either show up to yourself or you don't, and what develops depends entirely on which one you choose. The fourth is that you have to be honest in a particular way. The kind of honesty Jung was pointing at isn't the social kind, where you tell other people the truth. It's the inner kind, where you stop lying to yourself about what you actually feel, about what you actually want, about what you've actually been doing to maintain the patterns you say you want to change. This honesty is rare, and it's painful, and it's the only thing that creates the conditions for the unconscious to open up. The unconscious doesn't trust a self that won't tell itself the truth. When all four of these are in place, willingness to be uncomfortable, relationship with what arises, consistent practice, and inner honesty, something starts to happen that Jung found difficult to describe in ordinary language. The psyche begins to organize itself. Patterns that you've been struggling against your whole life start to loosen on their own. Connections that you couldn't see become visible. The inner figures that were fragmented start integrating into something more whole. This isn't magic. It's what happens when you finally do the work you were always going to have to do, and stop expecting someone else to do it for you. Jung found that the people who took this on seriously developed something he called a transformed relationship to suffering. He didn't promise the absence of suffering. He was clear that life involves loss and disappointment and pain, no matter how individuated you become. But the relationship to it changed. The suffering stopped being something that simply happened to them and became something they could be with. It stopped fragmenting them and started informing them. It stopped being evidence that something had gone wrong and became part of the texture of being alive. This is the closest he ever came to describing what healing actually looks like. The development of a self that can hold difficulty without being broken by it. And the only way to that self is through the room, through the work nobody else can do, through the slow, patient, often uncomfortable practice of being present to yourself in a way you've been hoping someone else would be present to you. If you've made it this far, something in you is probably recognizing this, recognizing the pattern of waiting, recognizing the parts of you that have been hoping someone else would finally arrive and do the work that's been waiting for you, and recognizing, maybe for the first time, that the only person who can walk into the room is you. There's a kind of mourning in that recognition, and a kind of liberation in it too. Mourning because it means letting go of the hope that's been organizing some part of your life. Liberation because the moment you stop waiting, you can actually begin. The energy that's been going into the search becomes available for the work. And the work is what changes you. Jung never promised that this path was easy. He didn't promise that it leads to constant happiness or some elevated permanent state. What he found, across decades of watching people walk it, was something more grounded than that. He found that people who did this work became more fully themselves. They stopped being divided against their own nature. They became capable of meeting their lives with the kind of presence that life actually requires. And whatever pain came their way, they could be with it without being destroyed. That's the offer. It isn't a shiny one. It doesn't come with the kind of promises the wellness industry tends to make. It just comes with the slow, real possibility of becoming someone who doesn't need anyone else to do for you what you can finally do for yourself. The room is still there. It has been there your whole life. The door is unlocked, has always been unlocked, has been waiting for you to stop trying to find someone else to open it. Nobody is going to walk through it for you. Nobody is going to do the work that's waiting inside. But the moment you walk in, you'll discover that you're not as alone in there as you feared. The inner companion has been waiting too, and the relationship that develops with that part of yourself, the part Jung called the self, the part that has known you all along, is the relationship that finally gives you what you've been searching for in everyone else. That's the healing nobody can do for you, and it's also the healing that, once it begins, nobody can take away. If something in this has landed for you, If you're sensing the room and feeling the pull to actually walk in, our guide True Self-Discovery was made for exactly this kind of work. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's framework, built to walk with you into the practice rather than just talk about it. The link is below.